Hello and welcome to the Real Film Podcast with me, Corey, and Phil.
Hello. Hello.
Today we are talking about scenes, absolute scenes. But we're going a bit different with it. So the way that I pitched this to you was that if someone has never seen any films ever, what 5 scenes would you show them to convince them or to sort of show cinema at its best? What would you show them?
And a good sort of then step on from that, you also said, to take it a little bit more silly, was the idea of if aliens were to come down to Earth for the first time, you wanted to show them the best of cinema. What 5 scenes could you show them? And the reason why this would be different than just choosing the 5 best scenes you could think of are we wanted to be able to have the scenes be really great without the context of the film. So these are 5 scenes that you can remove from the film and you can still appreciate how good they really are.
Yeah, and that makes it a lot tougher.
It does. There's a lot of obvious scenes that you can think when coming out there, but so many of them need the context of the film.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I pitched it, I was really proud of myself. I thought that's a great idea. And then about 20 minutes after, I was like, my God, this is so difficult.
Yes. So how about I kick it off with the first one? So my first one is probably going to be one of the more controversial ones, just because it's very recent. I chose Miguel playing "Remember Me" to Mama Coco in Coco. We should probably state now that this is going to be littered with spoilers. So
Yeah.
if you haven't seen these films that we mention, you probably shouldn't.
Yeah.
You can either pause it or just
Yeah, we'll try our best, but you need the spoilers, really.
So what happens in this scene is Coco. I'm obviously not going to explain the context too much because obviously it ruins the point in it. But essentially, Coco comes back from the land of the dead, and he goes to find his mama Coco, his great grandmother or his grandmother, and he sits down to play her the song "Remember Me." And I think one of the reasons why this is a great example of this is because Coco tells you everything in the scene that you need to know to get emotionally invested. He tells you, he runs into her room and she's sat there. She's very glassy eyed. She's not very aware. She's sort of like, he's trying to talk to her and he's very, very emotional, but she's just not really paying attention. He has a picture of her father and he's showing it to her saying, you need to remember your papa, Mama Coco. Otherwise, you're never going to see it, or he's never going to see you again. And that's the quite important bit is that he's not going to see her again if she forgets who he is, which is all explained in the scene. And then it just there's this moment where he starts crying and he's just thinking, I can't do anything more. And then he suddenly remembers the song that he wrote, that Coco's dad wrote for Coco, that they used to sing together. So he starts playing that to her, and then there's it's just such a beautiful, almost uncut shot of like Coco sat there and the life just coming back into her face. A tear starts coming down her eye. She starts singing along with it, and by the end of the scene, she is remembering who everyone is. She starts telling stories about her father, and it's getting a bit choked up talking about it now. It's just such a deeply emotional scene, and it's really the heart of the film as well. Like, it is the absolute peak of a really great film, but it's right at the end. But you don't need the context of the rest of the film to really understand the emotion. It obviously helps. It definitely makes it that bit more emotional. But I just think it's such a simple, a deeply affecting scene, and I think it just shows how good animation can be sometimes as well.
Yes, I mean, it's a great scene. I was quite surprised when you told me initially that was a scene that you were going for, because at first it's one of those again where I thought you need the context, but you're right, you don't really need the context. Is there a reason you picked that one over sort of other Pixar movies? Because I know that you have, because in my head, when you think Pixar scenes, Up is the big one. There's numerous scenes from Toy Story 3 that have that sort of emotional core of the movie. And my mind probably would have never gone to Coco. So I was quite surprised that you actually said that one.
Yeah, I did toy with, especially everyone obviously goes to the opening scene of Up, but something that I just thought, I think there's something about that scene in Coco. I think it's so deeply emotional and so simple. It's like, I think the sort of first opening sequence from Up is fantastic. I wouldn't necessarily call it a scene though, because
Yeah,
it's
that's
quite
true. It's more
long.
of a
It's
montage, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, it's quite long, with a lot of scenes put together. I guess that, I mean, that's just more semantics, but I think there's something about playing "Remember Me" because it's just a very simple song. But I think it shows so much emotion so effortlessly. I just think it's so. I think it's just affecting in how simple it is as well. There's just, I don't know. It's very hard to describe exactly why. Um, Other than what I've said so far about why I love it so much. But
Yeah,
I think it's such a deeply affecting scene, um, and I think as you said, Pixar. You could choose any number of scenes from many Pixar films, but for one reason or another, that's just the one that always resonates with me more. And I think a lot of it comes down to how much emotion it conveys in such a simple kind of setup.
yeah, it's a very
Um,
effective scene. I mean,
mm.
it's not doesn't mean anything coming from me, but I cried quite a lot during that scene.
I mean, for
Uh,
those who don't know,
I
Corey
cried a
cries
lot.
a lot. He cries a lot at cinema. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you going to sing the
So what's
song
your
for us?
no?
uh,
Remember me.
wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's exactly how it sounds. What's your first one?
Essentially, when I pitched this, there was one scene that particularly jumped out, and it's pretty much my favorite scene I think ever. It's from Paris, Texas. Uh, I apologize to those that haven't seen Paris, Texas, because this is essentially very close to the end. Um, but
Many of these are. Sorry to interrupt, but many of the I was looking through it. We've chosen lots of close to end sequence scenes. I don't know why.
well,
No,
usually that's the most effective part of the movie, I guess.
yeah.
Maybe they are the ones that resonate with you the most, I guess. But yeah, a bit of context. Basically, Paris, Texas is about a guy called Travis who's been mysteriously wandering around the desert for 4 years. He then gets taken back to sort of reality by his brother, a bit reluctantly as well. And he has to sort of deal with the fact that he has a son who he needs to reconnect with, and then he has to try and find his ex-wife. And this scene is the scene when he first speaks to his ex-wife, and she's working in Houston, Texas, as I don't know what you would describe this place as. You know those weird pervy clubs.
Pervy
You
clubs.
know where there's
What?
like a screen, like a double-sided mirror thing.
Oh, it's a strip club, isn't it? Is that
I
just?
don't really know because no one in the film sort of is stripping. It's kind of just and there's really weird like sets like where the girls are standing. But I mean,
Okay.
anyway, that doesn't matter.
Just a
Essentially,
voyeuristic place.
essentially, the film is all about baby steps. It's about this guy reconnecting with his son and trying to get this life back he's lost. Um, and essentially, this scene is him talking to her and telling her the story of how they met and what happened. Uh, and it's just composed so well, performed perfectly. Essentially, obviously, he's got his back turned to her because he can't look at her while he's telling her this. It's too difficult. The camera pretty much stays on him for the most of the time he's talking, but in the background is her, sort of at first thinking that it's just some guy telling a story, and then she starts to, the cogs start turning, and then she realizes what's happening, and then she kind of just breaks down. It's quite a long scene actually, but it's so beautiful. I mean, the whole film is just about baby steps of reaching this next point, and this is the final step he needs to take, and it's such a beautiful scene. I mean, I don't want to, spoil it too much, but I think if you haven't seen Paris, Texas, the whole film builds to this one scene. It's the most important thing in the entire film, and it's such a gorgeous scene.
And
It's
you don't think you need the rest of the context of the film to appreciate
not
its sort
really
of
because
emotionality?
he is explaining essentially what throughout the film we don't know. We don't know why he's been walking around the desert. He's explaining everything that's happened, and then essentially you don't need the rest of the film with him explaining and her emotional response, you understand that these two are connected. It's not just customer and uh, whatever you would call her job, stripper, sure.
Probably the easiest way to describe it.
Yeah, but no, you don't, because it's all about this confined space between these two people and the story he's telling, just involving those two. There's no sort of outside interference or anything like that, and it's so beautiful. It's a pretty devastating ending, really. I guess it's sort of both heartwarming and heartbreaking, I guess. But no, I would consider that to be my favorite scene that I've ever seen ever. It's amazing. But yeah, that's the one that first jumped to my head when we started talking about this idea.
I think both those two scenes have. Many of these scenes will have the same sort of thread going through. Those two are great examples where they give you enough context in the sequence to understand what's going on.
Mm.
I think that's the key, is that you can have all these incredible sequences, but I think quite a lot of these, I know not all of them that we're gonna list off, will have that thread of giving you enough context in the scene itself to appreciate what's going on, in terms of the rest of the film. But yeah, that's another great example. I was going to jump to my second one, which actually doesn't do that. I'm breaking the chain on the third one in already.
Yeah.
It's from The Seventh Seal. And I toyed with a couple of scenes for this one. I nearly actually went with the opening scene when he starts playing chess with Death, but I decided not to go with it. It's a little shorter than I actually remember it being, and I think when I initially think of that scene, I think I actually put more than one of the chess sequences in that original scene, because there's a lot of different sequences where he sat playing chess with Death, and some of those sequences are just outstanding. But like they all individual, and then when you put them all together, they're just outstanding. But I think they were a lot shorter individually than I actually remember. So I actually went with the confession scene. So this is further into the film, and he is in a church, and he's sort of the whole film has a big existential dread going about all over it. And I think what's so fantastic about the scene is that it's some of the best dialogue I've ever seen. Is the way that he sits down. He's basically confessing to what he thinks is, what I'm assuming he thinks is the priest of the church, or no, at least the holy man of the church. He thinks he's confessing to, but we see that it's Death concealing his face. But it's just so incredibly blocked into the way where it is so believable that he would announce all of this information, and not realize that he's telling the man, or not the man, but at least the person he's trying to escape from, because of like the way that he first sits down. He immediately just sits down, and he's like looking at the floor, and he starts spewing his guts about this existential dread he's having about a lot of it is just about sort of issues with his faith. So the conversation he essentially has, pretty much with himself, he has the Death has very, very little back to him, but most of it is basically just about the fact that he's come back from the Crusades, and he's grappling with this idea that God hasn't done enough to prove himself to this specific knight, that he needs to know that there's more out there, that knowledge is more important than faith. And I think it just surmises the film as a whole, because it kind of just shows you what's really going on at heart. And then he starts to talk about why he's having this match, this chess match with Death, but Death, as this concealed figure, starts talking about, like, how do you think you've got on for so long, and he starts to reveal his plan and how he's outwitting Death in chess. And then it's suddenly where Death reveals himself, and he feels cheated, and it's such a masterclass in almost a monologue, because there is very, very little back and forth. But I just think the dialogue is just so, like, it's so complexly written, and it's just it kind of tells you what the entire film is about: a man struggling with his faith, especially in a time like this as well. He's essentially a Templar, so the fact that he's struggling with his faith is, says a lot about what's really going on. And uh, it's just so incredibly done, um, and it's beautifully shot as well. Very simply shot, but very beautifully shot. Um, yeah, what an incredible
I
film
think
that film is.
we've both spoke about Bergman a lot, in the fact that, yeah, maybe we haven't seen enough, and it kills us that we haven't. But the films that we have seen, we've had such a, I guess, a connection to. Like, we've both thought about them a lot,
Yeah.
whether it be, me with Persona and me not feeling like I'm intelligent enough to understand it, but also, like, he's just got this distinct way of creating scenes where you just find yourself so engulfed in what's happening.
Yeah, and
Um,
they're usually quite simple as well, aren't they?
yeah,
There's like,
there's simplistic, but they're also very smart, intelligent.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, that's what I mean, but like not simple in the sense that it's simple as like what they're talking about. Like in its construction, it's deeply
yeah,
complex, but
mm,
there's nothing flashy going on. Maybe that's a better way of saying it.
yeah.
It's just not they're not flashy
It
scenes.
always feels
Um,
like he's someone who can do the basics in his sleep, and he
yeah,
uses that formula to create, like, very, very complex and intelligent scenes.
mm,
And I think that's why, people consider him to be one of the greats.
absolutely.
Um,
So going on for that, what would be your second scene then?
Mine is completely the opposite, I guess. See, this is where
The opening from Shrek.
this is where um,
Somebody. I'm
shut
stopping.
up.
I'm stopping. I'm stopping. I'm stopping.
This is where I try to think a bit broader, because, it's very easy to pick 5 scenes that you really, really love. And while I do love all these scenes, I wanted to think of, like, the spectrum of films. So for me, I thought an action scene had to be there, really, because it plays such a big part now in sort of blockbuster, and it has done for so long. And it's more of a question of, like, what action scenes do you consider great? I flirted with the idea of Mad Max Fury Road, but it's essentially just like 2 big scenes of action.
Yeah, it's just like I'm choosing an hour-long scene here.
Yeah. So the one I went for was the one in Hard Boiled in the hospital, which is it's pretty iconic in terms of action sequences. Directed by John Woo, who is fantastic. But essentially, it is just 2 policemen, one shot, as they make their way through a hospital, killing just everyone. Essentially, just all the bad guys in the world. And I think it's more. I think what at first captures you is the one shot, of course, you know. But for me, it was more about the little periods of sort of not silence, but sort of when the two start conversing in the elevator, a little bit about sort of the fact that this one policeman is kind of struggling with, uh, basically just having no confidence and stuff. It's very fleeting because the scene is just over so quickly. But I think it's just a really interesting way to shoot that. And the reason it works in this sort of in this conversation as well is that most action scenes, you don't need a lot of context, because it is just, if it's pure action, I think you can get on board with it no matter what is happening. So I think that's why an action scene was pretty important for me to put in. There are other ones. I mean, the raid also, came to mind. That raid 2 kitchen scene sequence is fantastic as well. But this one has always stuck with me since I was 16, I think, the first time I watched it. And I think it's very important. I think John Woo's an absolute master. Uh, you know, so much style, so much death. But no, that's the reason I picked that one. I think there's
Yeah,
not much more to it than it is just a fantastic action scene, and
yeah.
it's a bit more opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of Seventh Seal. But that's why I picked that one.
So I'll piggyback off that. I was gonna do a completely different scene next, but I'll just jump to my next one, which is actually the hallway sequence from Old Boy, just to keep this, action sort of scene going. We both put just the one action sequence, I believe, in our list of five.
Yeah,
And they're both actually quite similar in their the way that they're constructed, right? In the sense that it's one shot just portraying action, very visceral, very raw. So the Old Boy sequence, I just think, is one of the best 4-minute scenes ever put to action film,
yeah,
where essentially he comes out and he's holding a man by his neck. He's holding a hammer in his hand, and the man's got a rag in his mouth and he's bleeding out. He asks the 20 odd guards that are standing in front of him, who has blood type AB. They all sort of look at him a bit funny, and then like two raise their hand. He throws the guy, the bloody rag is still lodged in his mouth. He throws him and he says, "That man's bleeding out, take him to the hospital." And then it sort of changes shot to being side on with the hallway, and it's a very, very interestingly shot sequence, because it's like you have this black space above and below the hallway, but you don't see like any wires, and you just see what's in the hallway, and then everything else is black outside of it, and it just moves from side to side as this one man just absolutely just goes ham on 15, 20 odd guys. But one thing that I love about one of the reasons why I think it's one of the best scenes ever put to like action cinema is the way that it shows just the raw desperation like that he's going through. This guy isn't the guys from the raid. He's not John McClane or anything like that. He's not like this. I mean, John McClane's maybe not the best example there, but he's basically not a superhero. This guy is basically just your average guy that is just so um he's just so full of desperation that he just pours it into these guys, and he just has that, like, the way the sequence goes, he isn't the best, most competent fighter in the world, but he's just beating the shit out of all these guys, and that's what I liked about it so much as well. These guys aren't the most competent fighters either, and by the end of it they're all just broken and bruised. He has the knife stuck in his back quite early in the sequence, and they were all like, "Oh god, yeah, fuck it, is he dead? Yeah, I hope he's dead now." And then he just gets up and he just starts wailing on them again. It just sort of shows the sort of almost immaturity of everyone involved, that they're not
yeah,
no one's normally in this kind of situation. And I just think by the end of it, everyone's battered, everyone's bruised, barely anyone standing. Even our protagonist, he's barely standing. Then the elevator opens and there's another 6 or 7 guys in there,
yeah,
and he just has this look on him. Blood sort of drips down his chin, and then the next shot is the elevator opening and the guy's falling out and him just sort
yeah,
of limping away. And I think it's so expertly done, as you say, like much like the scene from Hard Boiled. Almost all of it is just one shot, just moving up and down the hallway, and I just think it's absolutely fantastic.
yeah. I think it's interesting that we've picked them, and just to go back to he kind of is like John McClane. He's just,
Mm.
John
That was
McClane is the
yeah,
everyday
that was a
man,
slip.
but
Yeah, I
it's
don't know why I
much
said that,
less
but
it's much less like Hollywood hero, more so
mm,
just like tenacity and desperation. But I find it interesting that we've both picked these like one shots, because a lot of films and stuff have tried to do this, and they usually do them pretty well. I'm a big fan of the one from Atomic Blonde.
mhm,
I don't think the film as a whole is fantastic, but that scene is the one that, and what I love is like capturing fatigue, and I think obviously as you
yeah,
described it, that's exactly what that one does. The John Woo one doesn't as much. It's more about being able to show that you don't need all these cuts to shoot action, and
mm,
that if you have enough going on on screen, that you don't need all these fancy cuts like MCU and stuff like that. But
that's what I was going to say. Yeah.
I think I find it very interesting that we've picked those two, and Old Boy was I was debating using that one.
Mm.
It's also quite a funny scene. Considering how
Yes,
brutal it is, it's
weird.
pretty funny.
Weirdly, it is quite humorous, but yeah, no, I think I think for both of us, there's a certain level of um It's funny saying it. The scene in Old Boy is about exhaustion. Exhaustion. That I think we're both a bit exhausted with how action films are made nowadays
Yeah,
because it's tiring not really understanding what's going on. As you say, especially in MCU, you don't really understand what's going on in the sequence too much because it's cut so much. You don't understand the geography of where everyone is and what's going on.
yeah,
It's just a lot of meaningless guys getting their head punched in.
mm,
But that's something I liked about this sequence from Old Boy as well. Is there's you start picking out guy because obviously the sequence, as I say, is just what like one long corridor. People keep dipping back in and out and in and out to fight with the main character. And I think there's something to be said about the fact that you start seeing recurring people every now and again. You start being like, oh, I remember that
yeah,
fat topless guy, and
yeah,
that skinny little run.
yeah. I
You
think that
start,
that sort of condensed space allows you to
yeah,
sort of recognize all these people.
yeah. But in
Um,
MCU, it's just a lot of CGI and lots of cuts
yeah,
and
well, I mean, I know. Don't get me wrong, Black Panther is a very important movie and it's a good movie, but that
yeah.
opening sequence in the dark,
Can't understand anything that's going on.
literally, you can't see anything. You
Yeah,
can barely see cars or anything.
yeah.
So it's just stuff like that. I think, yeah, I think it was very important for me to, put action on this list. Obviously, it was pretty important for both of us.
For sure. So what's your next one?
This is the one that probably had most debate about was Manchester by the Sea, the
Hmm.
police station. Um, the reason I wasn't going to put it in at first is because I thought you needed context, but uh, it turns out you don't need a lot of context. But I mean, this is one of our favourite scenes from the movie, if not the
Yes.
best scene from the movie.
I think it's
Essentially,
like the heart of the film, yeah.
I'm actually not gonna spoil this because I think if you haven't seen it, you deserve to watch it. You
Mhm.
know, without any spoilers. Essentially, Casey Affleck's character, Lee Chandler, is that his name? Yep, I think so. Is that his name?
Yes.
Yeah, we'll just go with
Yes.
that. Casey Affleck's character is sat in a police station. He starts describing basically his situation and what's happened. And the police say, "Okay, you can go, and we'll call you um, whenever something else comes up." And then he obviously goes outside of that um, and tries to pull a gun from a policeman's waist to shoot himself, and the gun just doesn't work. And I don't think anyone was expecting that bit either. But I think the reason I picked it once I'd found out that you don't really need context because there's context given in the scene is that it's about sort of performance and that whole movie, and it's about performance and the writing. I mean, that whole movie is about performance and it's about the writing.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
kind of just that movie's point where it's at its best, and I mean, it's a fantastic movie. Like,
Mm.
there's a lot of moments in it where you go, "Wow, that's incredible." But this moment, I think, I remember the first time I watched it. I don't know if we watched it together, but
We did, yeah. We did,
yeah,
yeah.
I just remember sitting there, I just like felt my stomach just drop. I was
Mhm.
just like, such an emotionally draining movie as it is. I think that scene in particular is pretty. It's just devastating to watch. And like I said, I won't
Yeah.
ruin it for anyone that hasn't watched it. But that's why I picked that one. It's one of my favorite. Again, another. Maybe I'm leaning more towards personal favorites here, but that is one of my favorite scenes.
I think there's a bit one of the bits that always sticks with me the most. It's such a minor element. I don't know why it sticks with me. When he pulls the gun and he puts it to his head and he clicks it and nothing happens. It's the way that he then sort of he stumbles back a bit because he's not expecting to.
Yeah,
He's expecting the to bullet to have gone in his head at that point. He sort of stumbles back a bit and he then sort of like cocks the gun back a little
yeah,
bit and tries to find the safety. And it's just this little bit where there's not even any hesitation. He's like
no,
confused and he's like, right, how do I
yeah.
sort this? How do I? And but then obviously, and then he's wrestled to the
He's
ground and
obviously
stuff.
he
But
doesn't know much about guns, but in that moment, that's the only thing that he wants to do.
yeah,
And
it's
it's just like there's no talking him down or anything. It's just like all this comes from this very calm, pretty horrible conversation with the policeman to then come outside and still a very relaxed circumstance. To then all of a sudden it's just straight away, just as soon as he grabs the gun, the whole place sort of erupts.
yeah,
It's such a fantastic scene.
it's
Um,
brilliant. It's absolutely fantastic.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, I mean, it'd be weird if we weren't choosing fantastic sequences. Let's be
It's actually a really bad scene, and I
honest.
wanted to let these people know that there are bad films out there.
So my next scene is the opening scene from Shrek. Um, no, it's the storybook scene's the opening scene from Shrek, isn't it? I keep thinking it's
Yeah, it's not the montage of him
no, I
living.
keep thinking no, it's this a storybook. That's not my next choice.
It should be.
My next choice is actually, I believe, what we consider one of the best films probably ever, which is In the Mood for Love, the 2000 Chinese film made by Wong Kar Wai. And the sequence that I chose from it was when they're sat in the restaurant. Now, if you didn't have the context of the rest of the film, um, it would take you a minute or two to understand what's going on. But essentially, what they're doing is they're pretending to be their partners. So you've got, this man and this woman who live next to each other. They describe how, they talk about being neighbors and stuff like that. And most of the start of the conversation is about the man talking about how he wants to get his wife a present for her birthday that's coming up. So he talks about getting the same bag that this woman has. Um, and what essentially the scene becomes is them trying to figure out why their spouses have started an affair. Um, and that's essentially what the film is about. These two people, you don't really ever see their spouses throughout, which I think is a stroke of genius. But um, they're trying. This sequence is so powerful because I think it's there's almost a confusion going on where they're trying to they're almost trying to humor each other by saying you know um, I can't remember exactly what she says, but she says something about the tie, and they both realize essentially that um, that her husband, the tie they came from the same place, and the bag came from the same place, and there's this realization that um, their partners are sort of sleeping with each other, um, and they both think that they're the only one that knows,
Yeah.
um, and I, I don't really know how to describe the scene as a whole. I think it's quite difficult because it's a very complex scene because they dip in and out of being their spouses and
Yeah.
themselves quite a lot.
Yeah.
But it's there's something about the film that's just so deeply romantic where these two people aren't even really being romantic with each other, but
Well,
there's just
I think you could pick a lot of scenes from this film.
yes,
Um,
absolutely.
I understand that this scene is pretty special in its own way because of the sort of, I guess it's the playfulness with the sort of emotional like realization that obviously that both of them know, and
Mm.
it's a very
Well,
short scene as well.
I mean, I think one of the sort of the main reason why I chose a scene is because I like the idea that there's essentially like a double narrative going on.
Yeah.
So you've got this idea of them; they both know what's going on, and at this point, they're pretty certain that the other person knows what's going on as well. But they neither of them wants to admit it and say it to the other. But at the same time, they've got this whole thing of trying to figure out why and how their partners have done this. Um, yeah, I think there's so many scenes that you could choose from this film. That just happens to be the one that I think is really is so condensed, and there's so much going on in such a short space of time. It's not confusing, even though it's quite complex. I don't think it's confusing at all. It's really easy to keep up with. It has all the elements from the rest of the film where it's deeply romantic and everything like that, but then at the same time you don't need the context of the rest of the film. So that's one reason why I didn't choose a scene from another part of the film, is that I think there are other sequences where you need the context of the rest of the film to really understand what's going on. With that one, I think it really stands on its own because it's like the turning point. It's like the realization in the film, and I don't think, because everything's described in there. As I said earlier, a lot of these scenes are chosen because they have enough context in the scene to stand on its own two legs.
I agree with that. One thing I would say maybe is that without the context and you dive straight headfirst into the scene, it does take you a little while because it's such a short scene as well. It takes you a little while to realize what they're doing.
Yeah.
I think that would be the only problem. Like, obviously, this
I don't.
scenario we've decided to base these picks on is ridiculous anyway. So I'm
Yeah,
not be too picky, but
you do recommend all these films, wouldn't you?
yeah,
In reality, but
it's
you know,
I definitely know why you picked it. That sort of like multi-layered narrative that they're telling within a 3-minute period is just
I think it's excellent. It's I think it's so good because it is a film. It could be a short film in itself.
yeah.
That's what I like so much about it, is that because it tells such an interesting little story in itself.
No, I think
If there
it's
was another sequence from In the Mood for Love you could choose, what would you choose? There's so many little good ones.
uh, I don't know to be honest. It's
I love. I nearly chose the one where they both go down to the market to buy the soup,
yeah,
and you have that just the outstanding score
yeah,
is playing, and it's almost like in a slight, like they've slowed it down ever so slightly, and then they sort of cross each other, and there's this look that is just. Um, but I think with that you need the
context.
context of what's going on to
Yeah, I would
really
agree. Yeah,
appreciate what's going on. That it's a great scene, but I think you need everything that's going on previously to really appreciate that sequence. So, what would be your? Is this your?
fourth.
This is your lot. Is it your? Oh, it's your penultimate pick. I thought it was your last pick.
Yeah. So
You're not done yet.
I'm not done yet. Uh, I think obviously, if like we said, film's a spectrum, and it's also been going for a long time. And I think be important to choose a film from a different period because film has changed so much that it's difficult not to pick a film from sort of like golden age. And I picked. I mean, this was quite a difficult one for me actually, but in the end, I did pick Casablanca, and which is full of just iconic lines and scenes. But the one I picked was, I would say, I guess just the entire ending. I guess I think it works. Another ending for us to spoil for everyone. But this film was made in 1942, so if you haven't watched it, what are you doing? um, but yeah, essentially, it's set in Casablanca, where Rick, played by Humphrey Bogart, in his sort of cushy little life owning a bar, is thrown into a bit of a spiral when one of his old lovers comes to Casablanca with her husband, who is a sort of enemy of the Nazis, and it kind of all concocts into this ending where it looks like the three of them, her husband, her, and Rick, will all flee in this plane. But in the end, it's when Rick says, it's just those two. And then they have that very very iconic part where I think they reel off about three lines that are just like some of the most famous lines ever. I think it's just something like he says something about be with Victor, that's where you belong. And she says, "What about us?" And he says, "We'll always have Paris." And then she looks down and he goes, "Here's looking at you, kid." All that stuff. Yeah, and the reason I picked this scene, I think, is because I think it's more for how iconic it is. Like, it's obviously a fantastic scene, it's a fantastic film, but I think if I was to show someone, um, basically the original idea for this was that I watched about 3 or 4 years ago when we were at university. I watched a video, and the title was, "If aliens came to Earth, what would you show them?" And it's just like a montage of just very, 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 very iconic and famous lines. And I think you need that. You need that. What's most representative of the period of time is this one scene. It's iconic. It's stood the test of time beyond all measure. And I think it's the reason I picked this scene in particular as well. Maybe it is I just have a connection to the endings. It's just more impact. But I would say I think it's sort of got that glamour of Hollywood, golden age Hollywood romance, but it's also got that sort of that sort of tone and sort of smushiness that only golden age horror, golden age romance can get away with. I think
Mm,
that's sort of like the pinnacle of it, and that's why I picked that. But there's so many golden age Hollywood films that you could pick.
absolutely. My next one's a golden age Hollywood. Um, But I think you've got a great choice there. Do you know what I find most interesting, just before we sort of move on from that, is something I found really, really interesting about Casablanca is that um, I don't know if you know this, they didn't think they were making that good of a film when they were making. No one involved, none of the actors, not the director, anyone, like no one thought it was going to be that good. They thought they were just making another, you know, standard romance Hollywood, and
A
everyone
B
was going to,
picture,
yeah, and everyone thought they were going to forget it in a couple of years,
yeah,
which I think.
and it turned out to be one of the most iconic films of all time.
Yes, and I'm going to piggyback off that into what another iconic film in Sunset Boulevard from 1950, and I've gone from the ending sequence of that too.
Yay!
Um, just, I think there's something that Golden Age Hollywood did really really well was endings. Um,
Definitely.
they always used to close it on such a big powerful note. There was this, I think there was always this thing that you had to make someone leave the cinema like with this big impactful ending.
Hmm.
um and I think Sunset Boulevard does that superbly. I mean, if you didn't choose Casablanca, I might have chosen it, but it was always a toy up between one of these for me. And this doesn't have quite as many iconic lines. It has the one iconic line of "All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close up." But I think it's such a perfect encapsulation of the film. It sort of starts with her at the top of the stairs, and um, she's confused by what's going on. A lot of the film is obviously Gloria Swanson as Norma Desmond, um, sort of feeling left behind. She's this silent film actress that's been left behind, and by the end of it, I sort of everything's kind of snapped for her, and she's basically just pretty delusional by the end of it, and she's got all these news reporters and police and everyone like just lining the stairway, and Mr. DeMille used to be her old director, and he sat there, and he knows the only way that he's going to get her out safely is by putting her back on the big screen again. And he has the camera rolling. She comes down the stairs. It's this very sweeping, beautiful, camera. I think something that's really effective about that too, and much of Sunset Boulevard and both Casablanca as well, is how impressive the camera work was for their day.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's always a good thing when you're showing a scene, is that in the context of the time, I think is important too. You can show how good things can be, even 70 years ago.
Yeah.
I think it's a really iconic ending. It has an incredible performance by Gloria Swanson too. Um, yeah, it's one of my favorite films of all time. I think it's a really affecting end sequence, and I think as well, if you're showing it to someone, if you're the idea of this obviously was to show some really great sequences in cinema. I think it's also a great example of that, because it shows you a bit of the behind the scenes of cinema too. You can see, the cameras rolling and how the cameras work, and you see the lighting guys, and you see, I think there's even a sound guy as well. Yeah, I think it's
That's true,
a great
actually.
encapsulation of all of that, where you can not only are you watching a great sequence in front of you, but you're also watching how it's being made.
Yeah,
Almost.
I didn't think of that actually. That's a good point. Um, I think I agree. Again, when you first told me this was going to be your pick, I was a bit questioning on the context, but no, I agree with you when you put it like that. It's essentially, you know, that through the dialogue that this whole production or
Mm.
production is
He
kind of a
used air
hoax.
quotes there.
Yeah, I did. Sorry.
It's a podcast. He
Yeah.
used air quotes there.
This whole production is, a hoax in order to lure this unstable person down. But
Mm.
then obviously, but it still has that glitz and glamour of a Hollywood production, which is
Yeah,
great.
absolutely. And I think something as well, everything I've just described there, it still doesn't understand it in the context. It doesn't explain it in the context of the film as well. You don't know what's actually going on. I've told you the ending, but I haven't spoiled
Yeah,
what's happened, which I
yeah,
think is one reason why it's so great as well, is that you can still watch the film. And although you know the scene is coming, the impact won't actually really affect you
yeah,
until you watch what happens before it,
yeah.
basically.
Well, there's so many from Golden Age Hollywood that
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that's a podcast for another day, just like five of the most iconic scenes from Golden Age Hollywood. But
Yeah.
yeah, for my last one, we're going a bit. It's only 8 years ago, 2012. Paul Thomas Anderson's The Master. Paul Thomas Anderson, I think, as a director, has films that are just full of scenes that are just such fucking like great scenes. But this one for me is the one that stands out the most, and it's the processing scene where Joaquin Phoenix and Philip Seymour Hoffman in a very tight space. It's when Philip Seymour Hoffman begins questioning Freddie Quill, and the reason I picked this one was because uh, there was quite a few scenes I did think of, but this one in particular, it's the fact that it tells its own story. Um, Essentially, Freddie Quill, who's Joaquin Phoenix's character, he kind of lumbers about and goes from job to job. He's kind of missing purpose after being in the war and stuff, and then he stumbles on this boat, which happens to be the boat of Philip Seymour Hoffman and his cult, is what they are. So yeah, it leads to this scene where they process him, where Philip Seymour Hoffman's asking him these questions, like he repeats some. You don't know the exact reason he's doing this processing. I think it's to kind of I think Philip Seymour Hoffman knows it's a very effective way of breaking down people, and that's exactly what it does. And the reason I love this scene is that Freddie Quill has three stages in this scene. The first one is he kind of takes it as a joke, like he respects Philip Seymour Hoffman enough that he would do it, but he's kind of laughing. And then the next one is he sees it as almost like a game that Philip Seymour Hoffman asks, like, "Can you do this without blinking?" And Freddie Quill's like, "Yes, I can do it without blinking. I'll do it." And then it breaks him. And I think that's the point of that scene, is that it tells you a lot about Freddie Quill in the space of about 6 minutes. To the point where he's just like screaming and there's tears streaming down his face.
Taking a leisurely walk down his face.
um, but yeah, I think not only is it about Paul Thomas Anderson's writing there and the sort of composition that he has, just very, very simple shot reverse shot, um, but also the performance. There's like two of the best actors like of all time, I would say. I think you could argue, and they both complement each other so much in this scene.
Mm.
And I will say, when I was thinking Paul Thomas Anderson, I was thinking of that one shot from Boogie Nights,
Yeah.
because that's a
Yeah.
fantastic scene as well. But I thought this one is just far more effective on a number of levels.
I think I think if we were to have the sort of motif between all the examples we've used, is pretty much all of these, apart from maybe the action sequences, um, have a way of expressing their sort of the emotion of the scene without needing the context of the rest of the film. And that's another great example of it. But I think if you can get emotional with the characters or because of the characters without the rest of the film around it, I think that shows how good a scene can
Yeah.
really be on its own.
I don't know about you as well, but this scene in particular as well, it's that obviously he asks Joaquin Phoenix to try not to blink. Do you find yourself that when he's doing it, you aren't blinking? Because
It's because it makes you actively think of it, doesn't it?
yeah,
It makes you
I
realise.
was like so wide-eyed while watching it that I almost couldn't
Yeah,
see by the end of it. Yeah,
yeah,
it's
great.
one of the only films that's ever made me do that. So
Yeah, it's 10 great scenes. So you probably have got very angry because we haven't mentioned some other great scenes,
yeah,
dear listener. So let's rattle off some honourable mentions, shall we? So what were some ones that were very close to you, or what were some ones that you thought were incredible scenes but you couldn't include
I
because they needed
think
more context?
I think for me, one that is, because I've always loved performance and I've always loved the delivery. I think the monologue in Blade Runner
Yeah,
is such a fantastic scene, and it's not just because of his delivery. I think the way that sort of the softness of his words and this like heavy rain pouring behind him is such a poetic scene.
yeah, yeah.
The only reason I didn't pick it maybe is because it's much more effective if you if you've watched the film, like with
I think you
him.
need the film behind it. Yeah, you
Definitely,
need
yeah,
I think you need everything that comes behind it for that to make sense and like really have the emotional impact that it actually has.
yeah. I think this is where we start to think about iconic scenes that maybe just don't fit this particular structure that we've got going. But what is there any more
Yeah.
that you wanted to talk about?
Um, there was a couple of like really iconic scenes, like here's Johnny from The Shining.
Here is
You know, like
Johnny.
that whole sequence of Jack Nicholson chasing her up the stairs and into the bathroom and stuff like that. I do think it's really, really great. I think the film as a whole is really great. It just didn't quite make the cut for me. I think some of I think if you were to take it by itself, the performances would seem a bit hammy.
Yeah,
You
that
know,
is true. Yeah, it's
and
Jack
they are a
Nicholson, as
bit.
great as he is, he's
Yeah,
proper hams out in that film, and it's
I do think they are meant to be like that though. I
oh,
feel like
definitely,
with
yeah,
because they're so subdued at the start that by the end of it everything's just so
yeah,
nuts. The opening scene from Saving Private Ryan, the landing on D-Day Beach, um, I think that's a superb sequence, a superb action sequence. Um, I pretty much didn't include that because I chose an action sequence already, and I thought the other four sequences were better than
no, yeah,
it.
it's,
um,
I think that could have been in it very easily, and it's one
it
of the
could have
best
been.
scenes I would argue of
Yes.
all time, definitely.
Yes, I totally agree. It's very raw, it's very visceral, but I feel like the hallway sequence from Old Boy was better.
No, yeah,
Um,
that's a scene that wouldn't
it's
have occurred
personal
to me,
preference in
but
this one.
I
No.
definitely respect the pick.
Hmm. I love the "Say What Again" from Pulp Fiction. I
Yeah,
mean, Pulp Fiction is just filled with iconic and hilarious and memorable scenes.
in terms
Um,
of like Tarantino, I was
yeah,
very torn because I really wanted to include him in it. Was obviously a lot of scenes in Pulp Fiction, especially the Jack
yeah,
Rabbit Slim scene,
yep,
restaurant scene, because that's one of my favourites. But also the Inglorious Bastards,
yeah. There's
the
two
two
sequences from that.
scenes. Yeah,
Hmm.
especially I would say I always used to drift towards the bar scene, but I'm
Mm.
thinking if I really think about it, what I prefer is probably the opening scene.
I and context of this question as well, it would be a lot easier because it's the opening of the film.
Yeah, definitely.
Um, I think I like it more, but that's just because I think that performance by Christoph Waltz is Oscar winning in itself, let alone the rest
Terrifying.
of the film. He is just so incredibly good in
Yeah,
that.
he's
Um,
hilarious. He's pure evil.
yeah, he's
Uh,
evil
he's
incarnate. Yeah,
intense. He's just all these things combined.
yeah,
Even when he eats
absolutely.
strudel.
That's yeah. I mean, the rest of this. That's what I mean. The rest of the film's great, but he could win from that performance. And talking about winning from like just a scene on its own. The first time you saw Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs,
Yeah,
that sequence where Jodie Foster's walking down the hallway. She then has this just insanely tense sequence talking to Hannibal Lecter, and then she leaves. And I just think that whole sequence is incredible too.
yeah. Do you know when you said talking of winning? I thought that was a really weird transition to Charlie Sheen. I thought
No,
I thought you were
no.
going to pick a scene from a Charlie Sheen movie, and that was your transition. I was like,
Shooting the chicken in Hot Shots Part 2. That's
yeah.
my sixth pick.
uh,
um,
but no,
no, I
yeah, the Silence of the Lambs, I think actually is another film that's just full of scenes that, in terms of tension,
mm,
it's that scene where she's in the dark as well.
yeah, that's
Uh,
superb as well. Yeah,
Absolutely phenomenal. I think,
because
yeah,
that whole construction of it as well, where the police are setting up to raid the house. She goes up, she's talking to him, she's in the house, and then the way that it's edited so that you think the police are about to raid the same
yeah,
house, and then it turns out to be a different house. And there's this moment, as you say, like earlier with the whole the police station sequence, where your stomach just drops. You
yeah,
have that moment inside the Lambs where you suddenly realize what's going on, and then the whole thing just plays out in the house
yeah.
with Jodie Foster. I think that's
I
an
think
excellent example.
one for me that definitely works in this scenario is the coin flip from No Country
Yes,
for Old Men.
yeah, I
Uh,
wondered if you were going to mention that.
yeah, I was, but and again, Coen Brothers as directors are people that seem to just build their films around scenes. Like if you think about Raising Arizona, I swear the
Yeah,
entire film is built around that weird car dog chase in the middle of the film. That's what it feels like. But
Yeah,
yeah, this scene in particular is this scene in particular is, just so, it's pretty terrifying. I think
it is.
again, it's down to the writing, uh,
Mm,
and it's all about what's under the surface with this. They are just talking about a coin toss, but we know, and they know that it's far more
mm,
than just a coin toss. Maybe we don't know exactly in it what could happen. It could be anything, but it there's far more tension in it than just an
yeah,
average coin toss. And
yeah.
I watched a video about them talking about when he puts the wrapper down, and the
Hmm.
Coen brothers kind of just stay on it for a little bit longer, and it's like that makes so much difference in the tension. And the Coen brothers are just on point throughout the entire movie. But that scene
Mm.
in particular, I think, works in this context. Yeah,
Um, so I also think the chest bursting scene from Alien is another one that you can mention as well. It
in
it
terms
does
of being
need,
iconic, definitely.
yeah, because it's like I think you need the context of the rest of the film. And I mean, the film's incredible. There's a few different very tense moments from Alien that you could potentially throw up into this, but most of them do need the context of the rest of the film. Um, but yeah, that whole sequence I think is, if you don't, I mean, if you listen to a film podcast, you do know what is it. You either know it's happened, you either haven't seen the film and know what happens, or
Yeah,
you've seen the film.
mm,
Um, yeah, it's kind of hard to not know what happens in that scene now.
yeah.
Um, I mean, there's a bunch of others here. There's quite a few that I feel like need the emotion of the rest of the film to make sense. So, like,
Definitely
I had,
one that I was gonna put in mind. Like it was one of my first picks, and I realized you definitely need it, is the Cinema Paradiso when he's watching the compilation in the cinema.
that is, oh my god, yeah,
Such an
that is,
effective, such an emotional scene, but you definitely need that sort of build in their relationship and the context behind the images or the
yeah,
film. You need that context in order to know why he's getting so choked up, because it is just a string of
absolutely.
random shots of boobs and kisses and stuff like that. It's but as a scene with the context of the film is such a beautiful scene. But
Absolutely, absolutely. Another one that I think is really beautiful but needs context is when you see the mothership in Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
yeah,
I love that film with like a very, this is more of a favoritism bias here, but I just think I love that film so much. And I think me and you have spoken before about how there's something that a film can sometimes do that has this sort of movie magic that you can almost not
yeah,
describe why it's affecting you. And I get chills up my spine when I watch that sequence where, the ship comes up and they finally, like, everything's finally makes sense with the rest of the film. I just think it's such a, for me, it elevates that film the way it's done. I just think
yeah,
it's so superbly crafted, but you need the rest of the film for that to make any sense. But I
definitely,
think
yeah.
as a scene, I think it is deeply affecting.
Well,
Actually,
that movie magic thing you're talking about, I think it's very prominent in a lot of Spielberg's movies.
yeah, absolutely. Well,
Maybe
I mentioned
that's
two in this honorable mentions. You have,
yeah,
the scene from Saving Private Ryan and the ending scene from
yeah.
Close
I think
Encounters.
also when they
He's such great at
first
that.
in Jurassic Park when they walk over the hill,
Yeah, and they see the dinosaurs for the
that's
first
sort of
time.
that movie magic kind of thing as well.
You could also have the scene where Indy moves the idol and gets chased by the
Yeah,
boulder, purely for its, iconic nature as
when
well.
ET is in the bike and he flies across the thing. So many.
Exactly, Spielberg is just absolutely filled. You could do a podcast alone on the best sort of Spielberg movie magic moments.
When Tom Hanks is in the middle of the terminal in terminal.
In Minority Report, when Tom Cruise sees his name. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the last
Well,
one, my honorable mention is, I wanted to speak about it just because it was in my five, but
hmm,
uh, it's a pretty long scene. It's like, it feels like kind of more of a collection. Is Rafifi is the heist scene,
hmm,
um, and this is again one of the best scenes I've ever seen. Is that it kind of strips all of that sort of. I mean, speaking of movie magic, it strips everything like that away to give you like a heist that's you know it feels real. There's a lot of planning and everything, but it strips away all music. The only sound is of the chisels and the hammers and stuff like that, and every single sound feels like it's going to be the undoing, and that's the
Mm,
point of it. And it's like I think it's like 20 minutes long, but
yeah.
because it's an entire heist, but it's so good.
Yeah.
It's one of the best scenes. I mean, it's in my opinion, it's one of the best films I've ever seen.
Yeah.
But that scene in particular, I think I felt like it was a bit too long to sort of keep it as like one scene. But
Yeah.
no, I think I want to
Yeah.
talk about that one because I won't, you know, ruin the whole movie. But if you haven't seen Rafifi, you need to watch it just for this one scene. And I think the context, the reason that scene works so well, is because you've had all this stuff before and after.
Mm.
But yeah, watch Rafifi, everyone.
I was going to mention. I was going to mention two. I don't necessarily think they would make it into our top five best. I just think they're two sequences that are really, really excellently constructed and are quite often overlooked when you talk about, especially when you talk about sequences shot so well. So one is that one shot from Atonement
Oh yeah,
when they're
of
on the
course, yeah,
beach. Um, People do bring that up, but I think sometimes people forget how like deeply complex that would actually be to shoot. That you
yeah,
have, you know, like 50 odd vehicles, you have hundreds of people, you've got to keep them in focus. There's quite a lot of emotion in the scene. I think that's you can watch that on your own and appreciate how it's made. I think that's one of those where you wouldn't watch it necessarily for its emotionality, but you'd watch it for the pure skill that goes into shooting that. And then
definitely.
another one that I think would be overlooked is the sort of the hallway sequence in the Bad Times El Royale, when the FBI or CIA or whatever agent he is finds the secret tunnel between all the rooms. And then the camera does this one shot of following him and looks in all the rooms and tells you about all the characters in this story. I think it is better in context of the film because it tells you who each of the players are in this like insanely complex moving puzzle that's going on. But in terms of like technical shooting, the idea that they have all these different people doing all these different things and they're shooting through mirrors, like how they didn't get any reflections at all, I will never understand. um but I'm just going to throw out like two last scenes from the Godfather series. I think
What's that?
the baptism.
I've never heard of that. I'm sorry.
You never heard of Godfather? Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's just a few couple of films no one's
Right.
really seen.
I'll
But
check
the
them out then.
baptism, the baptism sequence, I
Hmm.
think is often referred to as baptism through fire. Um, I think it's one of those needs context to the rest of the film because it sort of shows the arc that's going on and the full sort of character change that he's had to go through. But it's just one of the best examples of editing you'll ever see. Um, and then also the restaurant sequence in Godfather Part One, where you have Michael Corleone sat in the chair, and the camera takes this really, really long track in on him as he sat with the police commissioner and someone else. I can't remember exactly who the characters are,
Hmm.
but he's been tasked to shoot them,
Yeah, yeah.
um, and he doesn't think he's going to be able to do it. But it's this really, really long track in on his face where he suddenly realizes why and how he has to do this. And I just think that needs the context to the rest of the film because you understand that's where he changes. That's where he goes from this decorated war vet to, part of the mob family.
I
I
always
think,
really liked the scene from Godfather Part Two where he kisses Fredo,
yeah,
because that's just again, it's more just as an audience member and how you feel at the time watching it. Is that you kind of just when he does it, there's you feel that kind of anguish that Michael feels that he's doing this. He has to do this to his brother, or like he's found this out about his brother, and it's like it's
mm,
so painful for him. And I think what's one thing Godfather people obviously talk about it as this like you know monumental film in cinema history, but they're quite emotionally effective films when they want to be,
absolutely,
and
absolutely.
people just don't talk about that. And I think that scene in particular is pretty special in that way.
Yeah, as we've said many times, with most of these scenes that weren't included in our list of, the best was it needs the context of the rest of the series. I think to really understand
Hmm.
what's going to happen. Like you understand what's going to happen next, but it wouldn't affect you as much if you hadn't seen the previous film and a half, I think. But yeah, is there any other sequences that you want
I'd
to?
say
Any scenes
the only one really that we haven't spoke about is the Russian roulette one from Deer Hunter.
Yes, I've been waiting for you to bring that up.
Oh,
I'm
sorry, yeah, I just haven't.
No, it's fine. Go on.
Yeah, the Russian roulette one from Deer Hunter. I think in terms of performance and especially Robert De Niro, but I think more importantly as well, it's how simple the camera looks, but how important it is to build relationships between specific people in the room. You know, it's every person it's shooting for, whether it be like, it's mostly, De Niro and the guy, the guy who's running the Russian roulette, I guess.
Mr. Roulette.
Yeah, Mr. Roulette, Mr. Russia. It's basically those two are just like that pure hatred that De Niro is feeling right now. I think it's just such a well composed and paced scene. And I mean, the whole film is really, I know it's quite a long film, but it's still a really fantastic film. But I think that scene in particular is just incredibly tense and well paced. I think, and I almost did put that in because it is just a game of Russian roulette. And all you need to know in that scene is that De Niro is very, very angry. And it's a very explosive scene. But yeah, I think that was really another one that will always stand out, but unfortunately didn't make it onto our 5. So it's shit.
Oh, well, thanks very much for listening to this episode of the Real Film Podcast. I hope you enjoyed hearing our personal 5 best films that you didn't need context to watching, or out of context, I suppose is a better way of describing it. You can find us, me, out on Twitter at Philson Wilson.
Yeah, and you can find me on Twitter at Cospjord.
Cospjord. And then you can find you can find us at Real Reviewing on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you go to anchor.fm/Real Reviewing, you can find where this podcast is available everywhere. But Spotify, Google Podcasts, we're on YouTube, we're on just about any platform you can think of. Let us know if we missed off any scenes that you really liked, or if you disagree with any scenes that we included. And I hope to catch you in the next one.